Hi, I'm Huahong too. I'm a PhD student at ASU. It's a great honor to be here sharing my work with you. This work was made with a collaboration with Adam Dupay, Ziming Zhao, and Gao Junan. So I want to talk about robocalls with you because it's something that affects every one of us. Has a robocall ever affected you? So they waste way too much time, and because of that, I no longer answer calls from unknown numbers. But that became a problem for legitimate callers that are trying to contact me, such as a bank. The telephone spam is a serious and widespread issue. In the United States, the National Do Not Call Registry receives about 200,000 complaints every month on robocall alone, and those are only the ones that complained. In order to deal with this issue, the government already started regulating against unwanted telephone calls since the 1990s. Starting with 1991, a law was enacted to restrict most forms of robocalls. And in the year 2000s, the government set up the National Do Not Call Registry to opt consumers out of robocalls. And more recently, in the last few years, the government started hosting annual competitions aimed at stopping robocalls. In addition to government efforts, we also saw consumer products that made its way into the market. For example, the standalone call blockers for landlines and the various smartphone apps that can block unwanted callers. Unfortunately, all these efforts have so far failed to stop the growth of telephone spam. Using statistics from last year's government report, the number of phone fraud complaints more than doubled in just 2 years. One type of phone fraud that comes up frequently is the credit card verification scam, where the spammer would spoof the call ID and the audio to make it sound as if it came from the credit card issuing bank. The audio recording would tell the recipients that their credit card has been deactivated and they would need to verify their personal information in order to get reactivated. Of course, the true motive of this scam is to gather their credit card and personal information. This trend is deeply troubling, as billions have been lost to phone scams. So we asked, why has telephone spam grown in the recent years? First, we believe the first key factor of this growth is the high reachability of telephones. According to 2013 statistics, mobile telephone subscribership has already surpassed 100% of the US population. Secondly, the cost of telephone communication has dramatically decreased. With just a penny per call, the spammers are spending almost next to nothing when trying to profit from their victims. Today, spam distribution technology has become more advanced and more accessible than ever. With the rise of cloud computing, there are now hundreds of auto-dialer services that can be accessed over the internet, offering advanced features such as simultaneous calling, interactive voice response, and customizable caller ID. In order to better understand telephone spam from the spammer's perspective, we also asked, how does a spammer operate? For every spamming operation, you need 3 ingredients: a list of recipients, the spam content, and a mass distribution channel. Imagine if you are a telephone spammer. The first thing you would need is to acquire a list of phone numbers. And this could be easily obtained from a lead seller that sells millions of curated phone numbers at a cost of less than $100. The content of telephone spam is audio, and this is easily created with recording human voice using a text-to-speech synthesizer or simply duplicating the audio from existing sources. And for mass distribution, all you need is an auto-dialer with access to a VoIP carrier. However, due to the prevalence of scam and spam, some recipients may be using a call blocker or simply won't answer unknown calls just like me. And therefore, a spammer may need to consider circumventing these defenses. One way to do this is to use voicemail injection. For example, many auto dialers today, they come with the ability to configure an audio content to be injected into the voicemail inbox if the call is declined or unanswered. And there's another type of auto dialer that can forcefully inject voicemail without having the phone to ring. Another way to defeat call blockers and make the call seem more legitimate is to use a fake caller ID number. With most auto dialers, the caller ID can be easily spoofed because fundamentally in the call PSTN protocol, there is no built-in authentication mechanism. The carriers do not have a legal obligation to ensure that the caller ID number is verified. And in fact, some VoIP carriers, they sell customizable caller ID as a service feature. And you might also ask, what about law enforcement? This is what the PSTN used to look like. However, with the recent introduction of IP access to the PSTN, the spammer is now further insulated from law enforcement. And with IP access, the spammer could further evade law enforcement by hiding behind VPNs and Tor networks. And to make matters worse, the spammer can now reside anywhere in the world beyond the jurisdiction of the law enforcement. We know that anti-spam techniques in the email space have been largely successful at blocking email spam. So could we bring these techniques to deal with telephone spam? Unfortunately, this is not as easy as it seems. There are unique challenges in dealing with telephone spam that are not easy to solve. The first challenge is immediacy. A phone call is immediate and has to be analyzed as soon as it appears. This is in stark contrast to email, which could be put into a queue for time-consuming analysis. Another problem with dealing with phone spam is the content. The content of telephone spam is a live audio stream, which is much harder to analyze compared to text. To make the matters worse, the content is only accessible when the phone call is answered. Therefore, any solution that performs content analysis would need to answer the call, but it would disrupt communication and cause privacy issues. Another challenge in dealing with telephone spam is the high bar of user acceptance. A telephone call is arguably more important and urgent compared to email. And what if the call that was blocked was from an emergency service? Furthermore, with the way telcos are regulated, there's little hope expecting them to reduce the traffic of telephone spam in their network. In the US, a law exists which requires all the telephone carriers to move all telephone traffic equally without exception. In fact, due to billing regulations, telephone carriers profit from receiving more traffic in their network. Now let's briefly talk about the existing techniques and see if they're able to overcome these challenges. We've gathered various techniques from a variety of sources, and we are able to systematically group them into 3 categories. The first category is call request header analysis. These techniques analyze a call based on the header information associated with a call request. For example, the caller ID number is a popular type of header information that could be used to analyze a call. However, using the caller ID also makes them vulnerable to caller ID spoofing. An example of call header request analysis is caller ID blacklisting. We also have caller behavior monitoring and reputation system of caller IDs. Another category is voice interactive screening. These techniques analyze a call using the voice stream or the voice interaction of the caller. However, all these techniques have the downside of requiring the call to be answered in order to analyze the audio. Examples of voice interactive screening include audio fingerprinting, which creates audio profiles of known spams, speech content analysis, which converts the voice to text and analyzes for spam, and CAPTCHAs that interactively tests the caller using a reverse Turing test to check if they're human. Last but not least, we have caller compliance. These techniques require the caller to first satisfy a compliance requirement prior to being allowed to communicate with the recipient. The compliance requirement would be easy for the legitimate caller, but difficult or costly for the spammer. An example of a caller compliance technique include do not call registry, which legally prohibits the spammer from calling a list of numbers or potentially face substantial fines. Callback verification, which rejects all initial calls and forces the caller to wait for the recipient to call back. And also proof of identity, which requires the caller to provide an unforgeable identity token such that the caller could be held responsible for making illegal calls. Next, we'll talk about how we provided our assessment to these techniques. In the paper, we proposed a large set of assessment criteria, and the set of assessment criteria can be grouped into 3 categories. First, we have usability, which evaluates the ease of use from both the caller and recipient's perspective. The second category is deployability, which evaluates the ease of deployment, development, and operation. And finally, we have robustness, which evaluates the technique's resilience against errors and circumvention. Now let's put these techniques and assessment criteria together and see how they match up to each other. This is the evaluation of the techniques in the paper. But in short, I will provide you with a general idea of how these techniques fare against each other. In general, call request header analysis do very well in terms of usability and deployability, but they do poorly in terms of robustness, mainly due to caller ID spoofing. Voice interactive screening do poorly in terms of usability due to the delays and intrusiveness of voice analysis. But in terms of deployability and robustness, they're decent, but not without flaws. Caller compliance can be either good or bad in terms of usability or deployability, depending on the technique. But most of them do very well in terms of robustness. Unfortunately, no standalone technique was able to satisfy all the assessment criteria. And therefore, some solutions combine several techniques together to improve the overall effectiveness. And we're able to systematically categorize the ways to combine the techniques together into 3 categories. First, we have phase decisions, which combine several techniques together into a linear sequence of decision stages. If an earlier technique determines that the call is spam, then it may not be necessary to run the technique at later stages. Another approach is to use weighted scoring, where different techniques analyze the call simultaneously, and the outputs are combined to make a weighted score, which determines the final decision of the call. Finally, we have conditional procedures, arguably the most advanced way of combining techniques. Conditional procedures combine techniques based on a set of rules. This allows different set of techniques to be used based on certain conditions, such as the preference of the recipient or the reputation of the caller. This is a summary of the existing works of combined techniques in the paper. But in general, combining several techniques together can create synergy, as the advantages of one technique can be used to overcome the weaknesses of other techniques. However, due to the immediacy constraints of telephone calls, care must be taken such that the complexity of using several techniques does not degrade the user experience. And this brings us to our conclusion and what we believe the future direction should be. As more and more protocols extend its reach into the PSTN, we believe that the core PSTN would need to improve its core robustness. One glaring issue that continually reoccurs is caller ID spoofing. If caller ID spoofing could be effectively prevented, the simple techniques such as call request header analysis would be able to satisfy all the evaluation criteria. And preventing caller ID spoofing would not only be useful in reducing telephone spam, many other apps and services that rely on the caller ID would also benefit from the improved robustness. In this paper, we provided an assessment framework to help guide and shape future telephone spam defenses. But our work does not end here. As mentioned, we believe that the next direction should be fundamentally tackle the issue of caller ID spoofing. And I would like to thank our sponsors for supporting this project. Thank you all. And I'm ready, and I'm happy to take any questions.
This was a very clear presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Seda Gürses from Princeton University. My question is, how would you evaluate the different mechanisms with respect to privacy? Your last suggestion also with respect to ways to reduce spoofing also kind of directs into a very privacy intrusive solution. Could you say something about that? Thank you.
Yeah, so the main concerns for privacy is there are certain laws in the US that legally prohibits third party from getting access to the voice of the telephone call. And there are even some states that legally prohibits the recipient from recording the phone call. So that's where we see most of the privacy issues. And this is one of the biggest downside of these techniques that need to use content analysis, because they cannot get the voice either legally or technically. Yeah.
Right. I think my issue was not about legal, but it's the fact that you're suggesting like there's no more ways to do anonymous calls, which some people like to do. For example, to call crisis lines. That's a classic example. There are many other examples we could come up with.
Yes, we talked about, you're right, you talked about you want to make anonymous calls. There are a lot of legitimate cases to make legitimate calls, to make anonymous calls. What we're proposing is not to end anonymous calls. What we're proposing is improve the effectiveness of to end spoofing of caller ID calls. We can always tag a call as anonymous, removing the information. People can be more distrustful, but still allow these kind of anonymous calls. But I think the main issue is spoofing, using someone else's identity to make a call. Yeah.
Hi, Karen Christensen, Raytheon. So it seems as though the prime target for telephone spamming are senior citizens, right? And they're also the group that owns the majority or the higher percentage of landlines, some of which don't have caller ID attached to them and so forth. And given that they may not be as tech savvy, what would be kind of your suggestion on how to deal with these types of calls?
I think in short, awareness is one solution, right? We could, when people are more aware of telephone scams, it's more likely that they would have more guards against like this issue. Yeah, so that would be my answer, just more awareness. Yeah, but we think that, of course, fundamentally, we could also put some guards in place to stop this kind of, because reactive, like when we're trying to defend against something, it still doesn't solve the problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we should have time for 2 more questions. We'll go in the middle and then Patrick.
Thanks. John Spring, UCL. So my understanding is that the main monetization for this is actually traffic pumping to 1-800 numbers, because you can get weird monetization kickbacks. But are you talking just about personal scams to individuals trying to trick them out of their money, or are you talking about the bigger problem of this telephony abuse?
Okay, so telephone spam is a broad category. It includes scams, spams, and even pranks, right? So what was your question is about?
So like if I'm a bank, I run a hotline,
Yeah.
right? And so it's free for people to call me. So the bank pays the telephone company whenever you get traffic to that 1-800 number. So my understanding is that the main way that the traffic scams, like the people in wherever country that do VoIP to call in and whatever, they have setups where they get money from whoever delivers the phone call. Right? So if you deliver a phone call to a 1-800 number, you get paid by the person who runs the 1-800 service, because there's kickbacks. So if you so that's the main volume of this traffic abuse, is that monetization scheme. But is that not what the monetization scheme that you're talking about, or just personal, private individuals getting scammed? So okay, the getting money from receiving traffic, when
what was I talking about, like the telephone carriers? That's an inter-carrier compensation fee. In the US, if you are a carrier of a local city, you are legally, you have the legal authority to collect money from whoever started the incoming call. So that's one way to benefit from spam. Another way is, of course, to scam the people or do advertisement like telemarketing. Yeah.
I'm getting the keep it short sign from Joe. So very quickly, I want to ask you about your solution. I think caller ID spoofing is a huge problem, so thank you. But why is asking the PSTN to fix this problem the right solution? I don't ask Comcast to tell me who Bank of America is. We do that end to end. So why is it that a network that really doesn't get updated all that often should solve this problem?
Okay. So your question is about why doesn't the company themselves implement sort of authentication mechanisms for identity, right? And the problem with this is that they are actually doing that in terms of like banks. The problem is customer experience. Like if you want to verify your personal identity, let's say I'm the bank, you're calling me, and I have to ask you your like personal information, which could be guessable, which could be stolen. So information is not really.
I think we're running out of time here, but let me. We have a Usenik security paper that's coming up that I highly recommend you check out, and let's chat about it offline.
Okay.